contributing to the, oops, I have a real responsibility, I feel, when I'm the CEO, that the way I best contribute to the board, well functioning, and therefore I can be more successful, is if I know when I need to get a board decision, but also therefore how to make sure that they have enough information and that they don't get into operational topics. So that's important. And I also have to know that a lot of times shareholders are going to contact me directly, because most of the time they invested because of me. They might not know the board, and they're going to come. And I really need to know how to channel things that come that are really shareholder things from the shareholder, that I do channel to the board as opposed to doing it. So from a governance point of view, these are kind of the reflexes that are important to think about. I'll finish the three and then let's have a discussion or questions on what I'm presenting. Now, when I think now of the board, so one is on the board, I start thinking, okay, I have things that the CEO will bring, and I have a responsibility of a number of things on the HR side. So I do need to manage the CEO. I also often have to be the one, as a board, as an entity, to make sure that the management is compensated, has goals, and hired. Beyond the CEO, I often have some responsibilities of some of the key elements, key managers, and in some cases need to ask them to leave. Also, one of the things that in most countries, because you're from many countries, I invest in many countries, there's often the core thing that the board of directors is responsible for is the strategy. So I really cannot just sit on the board and kind of say, okay, just tell me what you want to do, or I'll kind of say yes or no. Usually I have to make sure that at the board, especially on the chair, that we really do spend enough time on key strategic matters of the company. And we can talk a little bit more when we talk about the types of meetings, at least what I have found very effective to do strategy. Also, it's very much true that I am there as a board. I have some responsibilities, and more and more countries, liabilities, to make sure that certain compliance legal procedures are followed. And we'll see, I was elected by the shareholders, and the shareholders want to make sure that at least the financials are reflecting what the strategy was. Everybody's okay. And the financials plus key indicators are tracked and in a way are controlled. So just like I receive some decision request from the CEO, I also have to continuously keep in mind that there's also some decisions that actually shareholders want me to bring to them, because they are decisions that they can make. So I have also a lot of work on communication, on preparation for decisions that the shareholders will make. So in general, it is about compliance. It is about control. It is about supporting the management. And it's very much about contributing. And one of the big mistakes that I've made, or that I see angel investors that we have, when it's kind of new coming in onto a board, especially as we're an investor, is that I think, okay, it's control. But really, there's a lot that we can contribute. And there's always so much to do in a startup, and it moves so fast. I really need to stay on top of things as a board member. Also, one of the things that we do continuously wrong as investors is that, and I think this is universal whenever I'm on a board, even if I've been able to get on that board seat because I'm a shareholder or because I've been nominated by a group of shareholders, once I'm there, I am not there to represent them. I am there to contribute to what is best for the company's interests. Just like I cannot, lots of people do it, and legally, yes, you can get away with it, but if we're here to hear best practices, I cannot, coming out of a board meeting, contact the investors who I kind of nominate me and say, by the way, this was what happened on the board. There's clearly, and more countries are being very clear, this is what is shareholder information and this is what is board information. And the board decides, here's what we have as information, and then here's what we give to the shareholders. It's not at all about hiding. I think all of us wants transparency, and in startups, you need the transparency because we all need to pitch in, whether it's management, the board, or the shareholders. However, there are some things that make a lot more sense that they stay in one place and they don't get spread over everywhere. So for me, these are the key things in terms of directors. Now, when it comes to shareholder, and again, we'll talk a little bit about all the things that we do wrong as angel investors because we're so eager to help. First of all, we go directly to management, but also we want to be part of decisions that are the board, but we often are not very good at making sure we follow all the things and are active in the decisions we can take. So the company purpose, usually it's in the statutes, sometimes shareholder agreement, it depends on every country. But at the macro level, expressing not the strategy, not the operations, but macro level, a little bit the purpose. Macro level, we've had a chance when we negotiated to say how we came in, but how we might want to get out and a process. We are the ones who get to elect and potentially request that the board members are who they are. And there's a difference between being able to nominate someone. Let's say a board's going to have 3 individuals, 2 that are founder nominees and 1 which is that we as investors can nominate. That's the nomination process. But then there's the election process where all shareholders have to vote for everyone. It is rare that once somebody nominates someone, the rest of the shareholders don't vote for that person. But that can happen, and we have a possibility. If we feel that, sure, the founders have 2 board seats that they can nominate, but maybe we really feel that one of the founders, there's way too many conflicts of interest, might not, and might really have no experience of the board, makes no sense that they are going to be the chair of the board. We have something we can do. Also, auditors. In some startups, there's no auditing of the financials. And maybe at the beginning, it's not really needed. At some point, it makes sense. We get to decide who these auditors are. We can ask the auditors to come and present. Now, the board usually is the one who definitely should be working with them, but we can. Also, whenever there's some critical decisions that touch share ownership, assuming that here we're talking about that we're shareholders, therefore equity, once it's converted to equity, these things are not always applicable when it's a convertible loan. We're still in the phase when the loan has not been converted. But once it is, we're the ones who approve whether or not there's going to be more shares that could get issued, so financing raise. We're the ones who can say, yes, we do think it makes sense that 10% of shares are conditional that could get issued and allocated to employees, board members, etc. When there's some fundamental structural and financial changes, we can be involved. Okay, so I find that a lot of times as business angels, and I've totally done it, we're so operational. We really would love to give lots of insights, and we sometimes neglect on making sure we also contribute and are very involved in the decisions that we absolutely can make. Why don't I pause here and see what are some of the questions or shared experiences? Some of you are very, on these three roles. Any questions? Nothing? Are you still there?
We are here.
Yeah. You're here? Okay.
Yeah,
do you want me to
there's
just
no questions right now.
No questions right now? Okay.
No.
Okay. So one of the things is many of us, we don't join a board right away, especially we hear the word liability. And it's true that I'm on a board, 2 boards right now that are very tough. And I actually hired a lawyer to help me understand exactly where I might have some personal risks, because some clients actually got very angry at the company and sent pretty tough letter from lawyers to the company, but also to the directors. And so sometimes we hesitate, should I become an advisor? And now that I'm a shareholder, should I become board of directors? Should I become an observer? It's true that there's lots of different things, lots of different ways we can contribute and lots of different ways that we can be involved in the startup. First of all, in the startup, most of the time, if we're neither a board of director and advisor, but we do want to know what's going on, and we do want to be able to support, I would say let's really look at, and when we negotiate, let's look at what information rights we have negotiated. And rather than negotiating that every quarter we want very detailed financial statements, which honestly in a startup situation to me don't make a lot of sense. It's really the underlying business model, which then leads to an economic model, and within that the 3 or 4 leading indicators that really make a difference rather than the financial statements. But then that means that what I do is I make sure that in quarterly I really get, as a shareholder, a business update, which includes what are the challenges, what's some options, and how does the board and the management feel that shareholders could help? Because we want to help, and we certainly can help. So that's one thing, that even if I'm not an advisor, not a board member, observer, I can still very much contribute to the success of the company. As soon as I'm getting more involved, then I have to look and make trade-offs between how much decision making I can actually be part of. Advisor, I'm just recommending, but board member, my vote really counts. Versus the liability, versus the kinds of decisions I'll be part of, versus whether or not I can or not represent the company externally, whether or not I need to be elected. A board, it's the shareholders, it's shareholders who nominate, and then it's shareholders who vote. Advisors, the board, even some cases I've seen CEOs can decide that they need some advisors. Whatever I do, once I understand the election and then termination, it's always good. I've never done it, but if today's here is best practices, it's good to have something in writing so I know what I'm getting into, especially also a time commitment and potential compensation. The liability, that's usually done by the law. But for the others, it's good to know, because there's a lot of misunderstandings when people think that they were actually board members because it's called board of advisors, but I was never registered. So on one hand, I have no liability, but I have no real decision making. But if I'm an advisor and I attend board meeting and something goes wrong with the company and the company gets sued, some people might say, but wait a minute, maybe on paper she wasn't a board member, but she had attended all the board meetings. In some minutes even said she voted. So wait a minute, she is liable too. So be careful. And the more, none of us like, if we're in startup land, we don't like things that are formal, but this thing of what is really my role, therefore what's my liability, what would be the time expectation, and if there's any compensation, I find is very useful.
Brigitte, there's a question from Gustavo.
Yeah. Okay, Gustavo. Yeah.
Rita, one question. From your perspective, I mean, how do you differentiate the board of directors or advisor versus the life cycle of a startup? Is this something that has to do with what are the early days, and then what is there a particular time in the life cycle where you cannot any longer just choose whether you want to have a board of directors, but you must or you will have to implement one?
Yeah, the board of advisors actually has, I find, two lives. The first one is, and when I say as an entrepreneur how I've used it, is usually before I do financing, like I have one new business, always starting new businesses, there I don't need a board, and I have no other shareholders. But as an entrepreneur, I find having an advisory board is really good, because it helps me prepare. If I'm at some point going to go and raise money, it helps me prepare. It helps me also, again, when we've seen all the things that a board can do, a board of advisor can do, it's a great sounding board, because often you do feel a bit lonely. And so prepare and sounding board is great. Then and pipeline, because when I actually then raise money and I kind of need board members, I tend to suggest to the shareholders who could have a board seat, I often prepare a matrix and saying, here's the kinds of things that I think the board will need to be, tough decisions the board will need to make, let's say in the next 12 to 15 months. Here's already who I know as a founder, here's probably the profiles of the two individuals that I know will be on it. I know you can elect and nominate who you want as a shareholder, but here's really the profile of somebody that we would need. And to make sure that we're not just a bunch of individuals, but a good board team, I would love to potentially, if you're going to nominate, meet people. Or, by the way, I've been working with advisors over the last 12 months. And here's two profiles of individuals who I really would love you to meet and consider that they become your nominee, because now they know the business. I've seen that they can add value. Their skills will be really required. And I then suggest to those shareholders who have a board seat that they can nominate someone in, people that I know. So I would say the sounding board, preparing, and also pipeline is good. Then that often then goes away for a while, the advisory board, for a period of time when we now have to get the board to work together. And in terms of number of people, I really like to start boards with 3 individuals and really avoid lots of observers, because even to set up meetings, you still have to do it as if there's 5 people. After, when we're a bit more developed, and usually the 3 are 2 founder nominated, 1 shareholder nominated. When we get later on, I really work well when then there's 5 people, 2 founder nominated, 2 shareholder nominated, and 1 an independent that we all elect. Once we get to a board is working well, that's when we still could have an advisory board. For example, if it's a tech company, especially medtech, you often keep a medical advisory board all through the life of a startup. Or if it's a very deep tech, there's going to be very difficult technology decisions where board members might not be very knowledgeable of that, except the founders. Then the board might say it'd be great to get a board of advisors. Or what I've done in a number of mine, there's so much work to be done as board members that each year when we do the deep strategy work, we identify some new kinds of initiatives where we say, wow, we're in a subcommittee, it would be great to have an advisor on the following topic, but at the subcommittee. So it's still, they don't do things totally independent of what we're doing on the board, but they kind of complement. So we stay a small number of people, but they can complement on individual topics. Any others, some of you who've been in other experiences, that's how I do it, but any others want to share? No?
There was a comment from Debbie on the chat. Okay, just in case you.
No, just highlighting, like, it's really important in Peru. It's really common for people to be invited to a board, and then when you get there or read the paperwork, you're actually an advisor. They may have you listed as a consultant. It might even be a payroll. For me, it's actually a happy medium because you get paid and it's formal, but you don't always have the liability. But you have to be careful if you're invited to a board to really look at the paperwork, because at no point do they call it an advisory board. That's fine. I think that's been my experience, at least in Peru.
Knowing what we get into anywhere in the world is important. That's why these kind of sessions, really, I made a bunch of mistakes, and I stayed way too long being chairman of the board of my main company as an entrepreneur because I thought I'd have more control, but I made actually a lot more mistakes than having brought somebody who would have had more experience. Or what I started using at some point that was great is actually a board coach, so that I could stay the chair, because personally that was important to me. But at least I was managing the board a lot better than I did at the beginning.
I would ask one more thing. It's like the other thing, at least in Peru and probably in other Latin American countries, the bylaws and the laws behind a board versus an advisory board can be pretty onerous. So sometimes getting an advisory board up and running, you're not bound by like public registries and having a quorum, minimum quorum, and things that are stated in your company's bylaws, which can be onerous from an administrative point of view.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions before we kind of go on how do we work? Any questions about maybe the number of board members and how do we manage conflicts of interest? Any questions on that?
Brigitte, I'll run a comment from myself. I heard from an investor that he suggested that a board had 5 people, 2 representatives from the startup, 2 from the investor side, and 1 like independent. And like it could vary, like whoever was on the board but there had to be like 2 startup related board members, 2 from the investor side, and 1 independent. Just a comment in case this is something you're talking about later, or you want to comment yourself.
Yeah, well, the number, so that's why I said I tend to start with 3. It's really tempting to go to 5 right away. I find 3 is already is good to start with, but and that way also because people like to see that it grows. So that way I have room to still go to 5, but because or else we go to 7. And in a startup, we usually meet pretty much monthly, and sure, really, really recommend on doing scheduling a year in advance. But I find it gets really difficult. And there's a lot of times when you have to kind of do meetings a bit unplanned because something's happened and you really need to convene the board. So I find it's much, much harder.
Brigitte, and one question, what are those key factors that you will use to take the decision to move from 3 to 5?
It's often in 2 directions. One is obligation. Most of the time when there's a new fundraise, and there's always a section about governance on the discussion on governance, that's when all of a sudden some of the existing shareholders say, hey, I still want to keep my board seat. And then a new shareholder says, well, I want a board seat too. And people say, well, but that means we're going to be 4. That's kind of a nightmare. So let's to keep it even, odd, let's then add that we'll have. So it's discussion, but obligation. Does it really add more value? Oh God, I can't believe I'm going to say this, but okay, my first instinct was like, I don't think it adds more value. However, where I would say it can also be because of strategic reasons. I've become in the last few years a big believer that with all the things that the board needs to do to make sure the CEO and the management can continue to do what they need to do, it's really good to set up subcommittees, because or else the board meetings become endless. because there's just so many decisions to do and everybody needs to have as much information, that we work much better when we say, okay, on the following topics, two of us will really go deeper at something, not make decisions, but deeper, and then from there make a recommendation to the board. If you're three, it becomes way too much work. So it's true that when you're going to have fundraising, plus probably a pivoting of the business, plus we are starting to have an evolution of the founding team, and there's kind of a crisis that's happening somewhere, and you're going to have to potentially have to do certain there's certain risks that have to be looked at much more deeply. Then three, it becomes 2 or 3 days a week, and that's impossible. So for me, when it's truly because there's more work and therefore more skills and more balance on how much time, that makes sense. If it's purely because of control, I feel so much of the boards are driven by egos and control in startups. And unless you don't contribute, honestly, it's a waste of time and it's actually deletes value. But if everybody's clear, there's plenty of work for, there could be plenty of work for 5 people as the company gets bigger. Okay. I
have a question.
Yeah. Oh, perfect. I knew you'd have great questions. Yes?
Yeah, well, in my case, it's a little different why I'm here. I lead like an innovation department in a big company here in Peru. And
perfect.
So we have like kind of like it's kind of like startups within a company, right? So for me, this is like very nice because I try to apply that inside the company. So there's some different flavors, but I don't know how you do it externally when we have like, I mean, for our board members, let's say, or our board of directors, we have certain expectations, but then in practice, maybe it doesn't happen that way. You know, like somebody should be like, I don't know, aportando, or like giving more to the board in terms of engagement, in terms of feedback, in terms of challenging or whatever, and it's not really happening. So how do you set up that expectation or that initial expectation as to how your board members should behave and like the value that they have to bring to the table? And then when that doesn't happen, like, I don't know how, if you've seen like issues like that and how they've been dealt with.
Definitely seen it. So I think the things is, first of all, I've been an entrepreneur for a number of years, and I think if that's what you were describing, kind of internal innovation and internal teams, I love when corporates set up mock boards, but follow the same processes as if it was outside, because even in corporates, you have people who invest the money, who are going to support in a way the startups internally. So there's a lot that I feel we can apply on what we're discussing here in the corporate world. Now, usually the tips that I have is that, first of all, the first thing that's helped me is making sure that people who come on the board, who get nominated, it's not because just of right, but because they're the right skills. 2, the thing that I've done is whenever we start a new board and somebody joins, I usually on one sheet of paper, now that paper can be very tight, I actually put 4 major categories. And like we've said, you know, things on strategy, HR, shares, kind of transactional. And I have a column, management, board, shareholder. And then at least nobody can say, but wait a minute, I didn't realize this was a board responsibility. They know. And then I create subcommittees, because subcommittees, nobody can hide behind a subcommittee. If you're in the HR subcommittee or you're in the risk subcommittee, you're coming back to present to board members. You cannot make a decision, but now it's not just the CEO and it's all the weight on her or him. The CEO has worked with the subcommittee, and now it's individuals on the board who come to the other board members. That's often helps, because that way everybody has to go deep in at least a couple of things. So that's one thing I've used. And then when all else fails, dismissal. Now, dismissal has to be by the shareholders, just like elections have to be by the shareholders, dismissal. But that's why it's important that the chair has strong relationship with some of the key shareholders. And at some point, the chair has to say it's not working. Now, if that becomes very political, and a lot of boards are very political, my last kind of trick, so to speak, a trick, but it's not just a trick, but bringing an external person who does a diagnostic. And usually if there's this kind of challenge, the board is not performing the way it should. It's not contributing. And then that's usually, then it's the facts on, and people who do diagnostic of boards are very good at being, not only identify probably things you've seen, but things you haven't seen that are hindering the performance of the board. But that way, when it's looked by a third party, and then I always present that to the shareholders. Anybody else? Because it's not an easy thing, because it can be very political who's on the board. Did that address your question?
Yes, Brigitte, thank you. And just one more, is there like an expectation of time at the start? Is it like, okay, we're going to do this for a year, or it's at least 2 years?
Yes, yes, it's written usually, well, there's two elements of time commitment, because some people don't realize time commitment. So in terms of the time election, there's big debates. I like in my companies to have a 1 year, and that every year at the annual general meeting, it's a perfect time to do. People go, oh my God, that's too fast. I say, yes, that's very little, 1 year. But in 1 year, you really know if somebody is delivering or not. And that way it's much easier if someone isn't, that it's naturally to ask them to leave, because every year we restart. However, most of the time people are reelected for at least 3 years, because also the shareholders are happy with the results and they don't want to block the board if they see there's a board. So I tend to do 1 year. A lot of people say that's way too often, but again, that's dictated usually in whatever shareholder agreement there has been, or in some countries, it's the law of how often people need to go to stand for re-election. Now, time commitment, when we think of different roles we can have as an investor in a company, because we can still support the company, we can even be a consultant. Whenever we're a board member, and I will look a little bit how many meetings and all that is. I would say realistically, you should look at it on 1 day a week. 1 day a week. People say 2 days a month, but if you take that, that's when there's not much going on. But it's very rare. I'll show you all the challenges that usually are facing startups. Therefore, the board is part of it. I find that on average, it's probably more like 3 days a month, so maybe not 1 full day a week. But it's if you want to do it well, this is not something where you just sit back. And a lot of times, the reason it takes that much time is, one, things move so fast, but two, you have a lot less resources than corporate boards. You don't have the money for a corporate secretary. You don't have money to ask everything for lawyers. Some things the board has to read themselves. You don't have a whole staff in the management that can do it. So that's why it's a lot more time. If you want to do it well, it's a lot more time than people think. So being invited can be great, but it's something that I would say to be taken very seriously and understand how long it will take. Now, there's plenty of startup boards who say, wait a minute, we are here to do the minimum compliance control. Others say, but really, when we see everything that needs to be done, there's no way that management can stay focused on the day-to-day when there's so much to be done without the board being an active board. Does not mean it's an operational board. It's still very strategic, but there's so much for them to do. We saw that huge list. including working with the shareholders, that there's no way that they can't meet at least once a month. And in between the meetings, there's work to be done or subcommittee meetings. Now, it doesn't have to be, but even the ones that just do for compliance, I don't see how they do it with less than 2 days a month. So now, I think, well, seeing a little bit the backgrounds and here are some of your questions, I think we're all convinced that governance matters. And it's true that many companies, if they have practiced having good governance, raise money much more easily because they can, their due diligence documentation is already quite a bit done. They can answer much better questions to future shareholders. The board is viewed as being a critical element of deciding to invest or not if the board is working well. It also can really save a lot of time, money, because usually board members were incredibly qualified, and we're really not paid what we normally would be paid. There's big debate on should we get paid or not, and maybe if we have time at the end, I'm happy to take. I say I understand that why the first 1 or 2 years, no, but I definitely feel, since I'm there to represent what's best for the company, not what's best for a specific shareholder, I think at some point, once there's maybe $500,000 that's been raised, I think board members should be compensated. Not a lot, but should be compensated. And I know that I can help a startup when I'm on the board save a lot of time and money. I know that that I can really help, that the decisions between the 3 governance bodies of governance can happen, et cetera, et cetera. Now, what's the difference between a large company board and a small company board? The 2 big things I've already touched upon. One of them is you have the same issues, but so fewer resources. So it's you have the same liability, but a lot less resource. So in some ways it's riskier. And 2, things move so much faster. From one board meeting to the next, so much can have happened in the business. So speed and also risk in a way are 2 things that are different than if you're sitting, you have a board seat on a larger company and, quote, more stable, predictable company. I think I've started touching upon this whole element that I kept on thinking of, how do I get the best board members on a board? That's what matters, and that the shareholders are happy. This is when as a founder and if I had 2 board seats, of course it had to be 2 of us who would be on the board. Over time now I've realized it's really about a well-functioning team where you do need to have both the skills, but also the diversity, etc. And so when I start realizing that, right now in my main company, we still have 2 out actually of the 5 board seats, founders, but last 2 years, we no longer have a founder. We each year work really hard to find someone who we think would be really good to represent us, because we view that the company is evolving on its needs, and in the founders, we don't no longer have all of those skills. That was really hard. But now we are still the largest shareholders, so we're much more involved as shareholders, and we're much more involved on making sure that the board is doing what it needs to do. So we've shifted a little bit. God, I hate reading. I hate formalities. I guess people say that's why I'm an entrepreneur. But as soon as I put my governance hat and I put my investor hat, I realize there's important documents, and it changes in every single country. But as soon as I think board, I also think compliance, as we mentioned before. And so I really try to make sure that I know well when I join a board, when I'm on a board, the key documents that have elements that touch governance. And oftentimes it's not in just one document. That would be great, but they're kind of spread out. And then, as I mentioned, I do my famous one pager for whatever board I'm on, so that I really keep track on decisions, but also the modalities. What are the processes to make decision? Who needs to be at a meeting? You know, what forms a quorum? And especially for the shareholder decisions, it's really important to understand what's the minimum we're supposed to, how often are we supposed to meet? How do the election processes work? So one pager for the decisions, but also kind of one pager with key processes on decision making and the frequency that's kind of expected. Meetings. Really, meetings to me are the heart of a good board. Not because of meeting, but much more on, and I'm still not good. I'm still, to all these years, because it is a bit formal, it's structured, and I'm a process engineer, so one would say I love it, but so much of the time we have to go so fast. I'm a bit more sloppy than I should be. So that's why now I'm much more careful of being the chair, because the chair of the board needs to really like this. So first it's deciding on how often do we meet. Here it says 6 times. In startups, I usually see that we need at least 10 meetings a year. Okay, we'll take 1 month off in the summer and maybe 1 month off towards the end of the year. I see that meetings are really a lot about preparation. That's why I've become a lot for subcommittees. One, because we have to make sure that what's on the agenda are true board decisions, but also that enough people have been in touch with the CEO, because usually it's a lot the CEO, some of these things, or whoever else is supposed to prepare, that they're prepared enough that people have the right amount of information, so we don't meet 4 times on the same decision, because each time we say, oh, but this is a critical information that's needed. Running those meetings, that's when you see, is it just a bunch of individuals thinking that they represent some shareholders, as opposed to thinking, not realizing that they, or not having the hat that they're here for what's best for the company? And do we let everybody speak? Because if we're a board, and especially if we've done our homework of kind of that we're complement skills, that means we have to let each other know. And then the whole thing about writing the minutes. They are really important. I'm leaving 2 boards right now, and I was the chair on one, and we did minutes, but we never quite finalized them. And when there's a new fundraise, when there's something that starts going on, people want to see those minutes. So there's a whole art on how to not make them too long, but make them relevant. And sometimes that's when, if I feel I don't have the skills, that a lawyer is very expensive, but many law firms have kind of paralegal individuals who at least help us for 2 or 3 meetings, both board meetings, and same thing for the shareholder meetings, show us some best practices, we get some templates, we get in the right rhythm, and then we do these properly. Because the documentation of, and showing not just the minutes, but what documentation was provided to the board members to make a decision is important. And of course, we need to make sure that whatever we're going to be tracking, we have dashboards, and they're not just about financials, they're really on the KPIs, key performance indicators. And yeah, it's a whole art on how to prepare, plan, prepare, run, and then follow, do the minutes, and then follow all the things that were decided in the meeting. So it's really where I find that too many times as an entrepreneur, we absolutely want to be chair because we think that's where there's the most control. But actually there's the most responsibility that making sure these things work well. And sometimes we need to know how to step aside from that role. We still will have one seat, one vote. So it actually doesn't change, even though it's true. The chair does set the agenda of meetings. But if you're on the board and you really want an agenda point to be made, usually that can be, that can be arranged. So I think as entrepreneurs, we stay way too long as chair, or as an investor, when we come in, right away we think, wow, the chair is great. If you don't have much startup experience, I would not go for being the chair of the board. I see that. I think there's some question. Any questions? Or I'll see in the chat. I think something new came in the chat.
Yeah, Jose has his hand up.
Perfect. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, we did. Thanks. More on the, not exactly the formal practices, but more the dynamics of boards. No, I always tell entrepreneurs that one of the advantages of forming a board is actually that you get opinions in a group, not individual opinions by each other, but in a group. And the group dynamic actually helps you to elaborate better and go forward. That's one as a comment. And second, one of the big things I've also seen in boards is the imposing characters, because, okay, yeah, everybody has to talk, but there's always either a very strong character on the founder side or on the investor side. And he or she sort of, it's mostly a he, I have to say,
Yeah.
tries to run the board and imposes it, is the first one to talk and always the first one to give the opinion, and then just drives the dynamic towards one side. When you want to have a more balanced and diverse opinions on this, what's your take on that, please?
Actually, I've been told I'm the one and I'm a she.
Nice.
I would say that, truthfully, in the businesses where I'm the founder and people invested, sure, in the business, but they also invested because of being a serial entrepreneur and things like this, I get passionate. Sometimes I get over passionate, and I love the input, but I don't like if people disagree, because I don't know. I just feel like it must be wrong. And by being an entrepreneur, there's so many, the reason I'm an entrepreneur is because so many times people told me something can't be done. And I say, watch me, I'm going to make it happen. So I've really needed to better understand that, first of all, maybe if people don't agree, there's a good reason. Maybe I also didn't prepare very well. And now what's helped is, as soon as I remove myself as being chair, then or that I start the meeting saying, I need a timekeeper, I need a moderator, and I need to make sure that when we do the vote, there's always, before the vote, we separate on any topic, presentation, clarification questions, discussion, and then a vote. As soon as I've done that, then I do respect much more of the time. And then if the vote is what it is, I feel at least there was a good process. So I think that process can help. Also, next time people get elected, there's somebody who, this morning I was in a conversation about a new election, and people said, he adds tons of value, but he's impossible. And the shareholders said, we've kind of heard that, if that's really, and it was the chair talking to some shareholders and saying, I know you're really tempted to re-put that person, but they'd be much better as an advisor. Don't put them on the board. They really take over everything. And the CEO really likes working with him. Great. Have the CEO be able to have them as a sounding board, but on the board, that person's really disruptive. So process, but also the shareholder realizing they have, that the chair might go talk to them, or the shareholders should realize that that person is actually maybe not helping the board. But when I wear all hats, my personality is a very pushy personality, and the only way I've found is try not to be the chair, or make sure that I have somebody who reminds me I've agreed to the process and I will let others speak.
Thank you.
Brigitte, there's a question also from Steven.
Yeah, great.
Yeah, yeah. Hi, Brigitte. I have a question, and maybe this could be part of the third chapter of the meeting. Yeah, the related with the challenges, but I am not quite sure. So what I've seen is that there's a huge difference between how a board works in a most established company than in a startup. No, and most of the time, I struggle with the management teams in the startups asking for things that could bring the balance between operational and strategy, but knowing that they do have more things, maybe a ton of things to do in a day-to-day basis. That if you compare that with the more established companies, because of the thing of having less resources, it could be, more difficult to get all the information to get on time with the discussions that we want to have. So most of the time I struggle with that one. What I found a way to help me, but I think that sometimes it doesn't work, is just being part of the subcommittees like related with value proposition or the growth board, not just to be in a more day-to-day way of thinking with the management team. But I always struggle with that one. And sometimes I feel like I'm being very pushy, and sometimes I feel like I'm just going through the opposite side and just giving them a lot of time without pushing strong enough. So for me, that's kind of a challenge.
Absolutely. Now let's chat about that. I think I only have we're getting to the challenges in one more slide anyway. The things that I try to do, first of all, as a board member, any request I have on data, I really first make sure they come out of the strategy session, which clearly there we usually get a line of what are really the 3 metrics or the 3 actions or the 3 whatever. I was at McKinsey for a number of years. I think we were taught to always think at 3s or 4s, because beyond that we tend to forget. But the key that will be important for the next 6 to 12 months. And usually once we're aligned, whether we're at the management level or the board level, we need that information. So rather than management thinking about what do they need as dashboards and things and what do we need, really they're being aligned of what we need collectively. Secondly, learning how to do, or if you join a board, feel comfortable doing things on the what I call back of the envelope, order of magnitude. There's a bunch of stuff I don't need, but that's also being an entrepreneur for so many years. I don't need a 10-page document. A lot of times I can do some very high level calculations and say, I think we're going in the wall because if this and this and this happens, and it kind of, because I know the business model, I kind of know the economic model as a board member, saying very high level, I think this is what would be the risk, or this is where I think that it's going to be really hard to do that. And too many times board members, especially if we haven't been in the entrepreneurial world for a while or never, corporate, in order to make decisions, we like to feel that quite a few analyses were done and things like that. And we were not very comfortable doing things, strategic analysis, but in a way high level, but pertinent. I don't know how to explain it, but it's stuff that you can pretty much take me to any, but to quite a few situations where with whatever, if the management is tracking, is managing well the business, so they know what their leading indicators are and all that, I shouldn't need so much more from as a board member, even though I have liability that they don't have. Your second, so that's one thing. And that's why it's good to mix people in the board who are very entrepreneurial, maybe too much seat of the pants, and those who want things more formal and more details. Back to then the entrepreneur. It's true that as an investor, one of the big criteria to invest or not is the team. And if I feel that there's a team that's going to be too needy, including on the board, then either I won't reinvest, or I'll make sure that when I'm reinvesting, I say, you guys, there's two of you as founders, and it's great technologically, but not only should you hire another person, but you should bring on another person who would also be kind of at the founder level, because we cannot continue to do babysitting. This is not, we're not a substitute. The board is not a substitute for management. That is not the right use. And that again is an important discussion that the board can have with the shareholders. Because ultimately it's often at a financing round where this will come up. And I don't know, is that where you were talking a little bit about the babysitting, where they need too much support?
Yeah.
Or did
Yeah. No. That complete. I mean, that one and the previous one totally answer my question.
Okay. So now let's get to the last thing about the meetings and then the challenges. Wait, why am I not here? In terms of meetings, I really like to separate, and I actually plan for the year what types of meetings, board meetings will occur. The ones that we've said, the 6 to 8 a year, and usually you always have, what are the business decisions? Where are we on key metrics? Where are we on risk? And any other board matters and HR kind of standard template topics. And then of course the decisions are different in each one. Then there's really the deep kind of strategy sessions, and we don't have time. That could be, I did a session this morning just on kind of the strategy sessions on the board, but they are different and they need to be more open. They can invite other people. The only tip that I have there is, in order again to be able to make decisions, as much as possible, have a simple financial model that you don't need a CFO to do, that between the CEO and a couple people on the board, we know how to do, so we can run scenarios, because so much of startup is scenario planning and having, already in the back pocket another scenario, so that in 3 months something doesn't work, we'll have to shift a bit more to the left or to the right. And then the meetings where we're really working on preparation for the shareholder meetings, and the shareholder updates and the annual general meeting and shareholder decisions. So separating the meetings are important. As I said, to me, that's the heart meeting, including subcommittees who help prepare meetings, but there are different types of meetings on the board. And for many of these different types of meetings, it's also driven that for any single decision, there can be involvement then of the management, the shareholders, and the board. So especially if you're the chair of the board, making sure that for a decision, you've mapped out who will have to do what, so that the meetings are as efficient as possible. Now the challenges. Challenges can come from so many different directions. First, in terms of the business is something that, yes, once a year, I like in a startup world, with, of course, the CEO, the founders, of what if we were to start again? What would we look like? I think it's important to do that. And that's where sometimes it's good to have, very good to have somebody even from the outside kind of saying, here's how you're perceived on the outside. This is also the time where, even if the heads of the shareholders, they've come in just recently and they would like an exit in 5 years, or the entrepreneurs say, oh, I don't want to exit until I have revenues of a couple million. Twice a year, to keep an eye, and it's the board who can do that, especially subcommittee, of what's happening at the industry level structurally, because this might be now that a consolidation is happening and the little guys are being bought by the big guys. And if we're not one of them, we're going to have a very tough situation. Or one of our competitors just raised 20 million and we were just about to do a 2 million raise. Big, even though we're super good and we're very capital efficient, that could change the whole competitive landscape. So so much can happen that all of a sudden can make that we need to shift. And if we say, oh, but since 6 months we're meeting, or we're not the kind of board that can give stability at the same time agility, we're in the wrong place and we have a big crisis. There's also a bunch of things that can happen reputation-wise, regulatory-wise, and the board is very much in that. Remember, the board has also a public responsibility. So that is some things to keep track. Human resources, the babysitting, realization that the CEO, great founder, is not going to be probably the right person. I realized it, or the CEO realizes it. As I said, if it's really one of my baby companies, it can be difficult to be a board member in one of those companies, because even when I decide maybe I'm no longer the right CEO, am I going to still act as CEO once the CEO is hired? Is there really a big gap in some skill? Or is there big risk because too much of the company is still in a person's head? And the shareholders have also put us there so that we make sure there's succession planning. Remember, we're here to hire, to select, also to motivate, and to ensure that some of the key skills are there, but also if one disappears, something, the company doesn't collapse. And then some blockages, inner fighting. What's really sad in startups, when you see that because, and sometimes for the wrong reasons, roles get mixed up, emotions start happening. Somebody says, a shareholder says, but wait a minute, this is not the strategy I bought in for. And you say, but wait a minute, shareholder is purpose. It's still the right purpose. But no, as a shareholder, I want to control this. And then you end up spending more time on and energy on inwardly topics versus the market is blossoming, growing, and competitors are starting to get sales like crazy, and you're not moving. So it's really a board anticipating many of these things, being aware of these things, being street smart on how you deal with these. And street smart is, we're never going to get all the right data. We're never going to have all the documents 100%, but let's make sure that we stay compliant, and at the same time, we're agile. Very, very important. The statistics are, I don't know in Peru and the other countries represented today, but worldwide, when we're in a startup, the statistics are that out of 10, probably 4 will die. And avoiding bankruptcy, knowing how to wind down properly or quickly merging it with something else so it finishes, is a big art as a board member. It's a big responsibility as a board member. Bankruptcy is not a good solution for lots and lots of different reasons. But 4 will wind down. 4 will probably do okay, but the shareholders are getting impatient because they're not sexy enough that they're going to get bought. They're not profitable enough that the founders can just buy back. And people are saying, I want to get out. And then you have 2 where even that, getting the right time, the right exit for everybody in the company, they'll be successful. But there's a number of things that could happen that the exit doesn't happen as planned. So there's a lot of moving parts, and the board is really at the heart of that. And that's why the board can't at the same time be babysitting the management. There's plenty to do for the management, plenty to do for the board, and there's also lots to do for the shareholders. And that's why one of the things that boards complain about, and for many years, I think I was at the heart of causing this, was the whole thing of, as a business angel, I thought, okay, I'm not on the board. I invested because of a great team. I want to stay in touch with the entrepreneur and I want to help. So I kept contacting the entrepreneur. That really did not help. And especially for the board, who was giving one direction potentially to the entrepreneur, and hearing that the shareholders, business angels, were giving another direction. So the best is what we've already talked about. First of all, making sure that there's shareholder updates, making sure that the board is known by the business angels and says, if you want to help, great, but please coordinate through us. I want to make sure that we have enough time before I go a little bit with potential final tips. Any other question, discussion, shared best practices?
I just wanted to mention that I think the tip about angel investors is really important in our more emerging markets where angel investors may have a disproportionate amount of voice even later in the process and may not understand the importance of later investors and board members. So I'd be interested to hear maybe an anecdote or two from you or other participants to kind of help us all ground on how we could try to rein in angel investors, knowing that some of us are angel investors, and avoid board problems there.
I think the first thing I wish I had done, I wish I had gone board training way earlier on. I too thought, okay, board is compliance, so you have to do it. Board is control, but as an angel, I'm going to contribute to the team, to the management. Whereas the board is actually where, first of all, one of us can be on the board, and the board is much more. You've seen now the whole list of the things that the board is involved in, because they are strategic decisions. And they were all outside of operational decisions. So there's a lot that the board can be involved in, plenty. And so as a business angel, one, I can be on the board and contribute already there. I don't have to just contribute on sales contacts and that operational things to the CEO. And two, I just have to channel my energy through the board so that at least I'm not sending different signals. If I had just, I don't know if I would have done much better, but I think at least it would have helped. So we see, for example, a number of countries now, we're so happy that business angels and founders are taking, we have a whole curriculum on board and with live cases, and they're starting to develop a common language, and we're starting to shift the vision that a board is way beyond compliance and control. It's also a key body of contribution. Any other failures?
Yeah, Brigitte, I have one more
failures,
question.
yeah, or successes. Yeah, go ahead.
It is more related to hiring and talent. What is your recommendation, or what has been your experience regarding being the board involved in hiring or recommending talent for a startup of an organization?
So the role, and is your question like how involved should the board be, or what's your?
Yeah.
Well,
yeah.
So
what has been the level of involvement of board members and the board, and also like I think advisors to some extent in that particular topic.
So normally, first of all, there's a minimum amount that's usually asked by the shareholders to the board. So again, I go back to when there's a financing round, that's when a lot of these things get discussed. And where some shareholders might say, we want the board to be so many people, to meet so many times, blah, blah, and we want them to take care of the following decisions. And that can include, we want them, the CEO is clear, but also here's the 3 positions that we want the board to be part of defining, triggering when that position will be filled, if it was not yet filled, being part of the recruitment, doing the final decision on recruitment, compensation, and of course, then it's the CEO will manage, but once a year doing a review of that position and that person with the CEO. So usually it starts with whatever's written. Beyond that, I do find that beyond what is legally required or agreed through shareholder agreements or whatever agreements there are, where shareholders dictate a little bit about governance, the board there's still a wide range. So that's a discussion to have between us as a board. Do we want to do the strict minimum, or do we want to do more? That goes back to also management. Does the management actually need us to do more because they're very junior? So I think it's there's the minimums that are required, but then there's a lot more that the board can do. I find that, again, mistakes oh, please go ahead.
No, and in terms of the requirements, typically do you see this in round A, B, C? Where is there any particular round where you see this more happening or that varies from the size of the round and the sector where the company is working?
I think what I see is two things. Over time, hats start separating. At first, in most of my companies, the first couple of years, and usually the first up to the first kind of 2 million of fundraise, which is still more family, friends, familiars, angel investors, family offices, there's still that most of the management, the two people who are representing founders are still very, very active in the management, and they're still the largest shareholders. So the three things get muddled up. So we don't put much in writing. We just do it because anyway, we're the ones who would do it with one hat or the other. As we start, so that can be in Series A, but 50% of my startups never go to VC. We exit with grants, with angel money, with being able to do different things. They exit at 10, 20, 40, $50 million to corporates, and we're all very happy. So we never went to actually like big VC. For some we have to go to, not have to, but decide that yes, institutional investors make sense. And their institutional, that's when there's often the beginning of a shift, that the founders might no longer be the CEO and all this. And that's when these things, yes, come in more formally. But it's not the amount of money, it's more because the roles start to shift or separate.
Brigitte, and I have another question that is kind of related with that one. So what should be some key considerations when you take a decision from shifting the CEO, from a founder CEO to an external CEO? And in a way, those considerations could change depending on the stage of the startup. I mean, for example, just taking the decision in a Series B instead of taking it in a Series D. What could be those key components?
For me, the one thing I think we completely underestimate, and I've seen this not just in my own companies, but being part of startups that went on to go do an IPO and all this. For me, the core first individuals, not only are they individuals and you can look them as skills, but there's also, they truly created the DNA, the culture of the company. And removing them should also have cultural considerations, not just skills considerations. But I believe a lot of being on the board is psychology and supporting, and startups more than any other business is about people, because there's the DNA, and also the reason as startups, and then I'm going to talk as an entrepreneur, one of the reasons we're so capital efficient is because if I'm passionate about something and I believe in it so much, you can pay me $30,000. I'll work the 24/7. And I saw that in companies where I really failed in replacing me as CEO. And I will do things until they happen, because it shall be. I might not quite get to where we thought we'd be, but I and my team, it shall be. When we go in the whole hiring, and I've been a corporate hire, and I've been very successful, but when I hired, for example, a CEO to replace me, first of all, it was 200,000 versus my little 50. Okay, I had 40% of shares. And it was let's talk about boundaries of when I work or not. And even though I don't feel people need to work 60 hours or 80 hours to be efficient, but it became a lot more, I will try. Never said, but the whole being was that. And I went way too fast to think that the business, because we had achieved such great milestones, that I thought we could shift to, it's more of a corporate, it's more of a hired, it's more formal, a lot more processes, because I am a bit seat of the pants, but I think I'm really smart. So I usually, no, but formal, and we failed. Great person, wrong time. So I don't know how to express these, but I fight a lot more now on the boards to really think hard about replacing versus adjusting, complementing. Because startups are beautiful animals, but they're wild. You don't know yet and sometimes they're too wild. But this capital efficiency there's reasons of why it's so much more than any replication of that in a corporate, and there's things that should be done in corporate environments. But I think we totally underestimate, and we often replace way too early. Now, adapt and make them aware of and all that, absolutely. But the replacement, I think, at least the first 5 years, I try not to. I try to evolve their role, all sorts of things, but be really careful. Okay, as you can see, we've run out of time. I think I'm happy to stay a few more minutes, but here are a few kind of tips. There's many more, but what I tried to put here is the main ones. And I know that there's a few last words. So why don't we do the few last words, and then I'm happy if anybody wants to stay a few more minutes afterwards. Thank you so much for this wonderful opportunity. I hope it's been useful, and being a board member is a whole other journey than being an entrepreneur and an angel investor. And it did take me quite a bit of time to, I want to stop sharing, bit of time. But it is a journey that I'm still learning a lot about, and hope this was useful.
Thank you, Brigitte. Probably Luis, if you don't mind, I think Brigitte, it was very nice listening to you, and I think we all have learned a lot from this session. I just wanted to take a few minutes to announce that together with the CAP, with COFIDE, with the program C Competitivo, and la Cooperación Suiza en el Perú, SECO, we are happy to announce that we are going to have a FINO providing training and courses, which will go much more in depth of what we have heard just today. Today we have had 2 sessions. So this is the second session that we are having with the FINO. But we are going to have them from August 9th onwards. And we are sharing now on the chat a link where you can register yourself if you would like to hear more about the content of this training and how when the trainings will be given, and more details on the program. So I invite all of you to share with us your contact details, and we will be happy to tell you more about this training that will be launched from August the 9th. Thank you very much. Luis, back to you.
Oh, well, thank you, Gustavo, Brigitte. I don't know if we have space for maybe a final question or final 2 questions. But yeah, it was very insightful, Brigitte. And as I mentioned, like, we didn't see a training like this before for Latin America, at least. So yeah, very happy to have you here today.
Very welcome. Okay. And I've left, that way, if you think of something, I've left my email address, feel free to contact. And I look forward to hopefully seeing a number of you starting in August. So that's great news. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Brigitte.
Bye, Brigitte.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye, Brigitte.